The night my 9-year-old daughter came home from the hospital after collapsing from an asthma attack. My father pounded on my front door hard enough to wake her upstairs. When I opened it, he did not ask whether Nora was breathing normally again. He did not ask whether she was scared, whether the doctors were worried, or whether I needed anything. He stared at me and demanded, "What did you tell them?" That was the moment I understood I was dealing with something much older than one terrible afternoon. Before I tell you how a missing inhaler uncovered a lie my family had kept alive for 30 years, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what I learned about my father changed almost every childhood memory I trusted. And if you enjoy family stories where the truth eventually catches up with the people who thought they controlled it, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the end. 4 months have passed since that night, and I can tell the story now without feeling my pulse jump every time I remember my mother's voice. Back in April, I was 39, divorced, raising Nora mostly on my own, and working as a branch operations manager outside Columbus, Ohio. My job had trained me to deal with problems by separating facts from panic. When something went wrong at work, I built a timeline, found the failure point, and fixed whatever process had allowed it to happen. That habit would eventually save me from being dragged into my parents' version of events, but on the morning everything started, I had no reason to think I would need it. Nora had asthma, but she was not a fragile child. She played outside, went to school, argued about bedtime, and could turn getting dressed into a negotiation that would have impressed a union lawyer. She also knew her asthma plan. Before I left her at my parents' house that Saturday, I watched her unzip the front pocket of her backpack and tap the rescue inhaler and spacer inside. I had taught her one rule from the time she was old enough to understand it: know where your medicine is, and tell an adult when you need it. My mother, Susan, watched us from the kitchen and shook her head. "You check that thing every time she leaves the house," she said. "I check that she knows where it is." "She knows. You've made sure she knows." There was something in her tone, but there was often something in my mother's tone. She had opinions about modern parenting, medication, food labels, school counselors, screen time, and anything else that had changed since she raised me. She had said more than once that children were medicated for every little problem now, and she had suggested that some of Nora's breathing trouble became worse because I reacted too quickly. I disagreed every time. What she had never done before was interfere with Nora's medication. I thought there was a wide gap between saying something ignorant and actually doing something dangerous. I was wrong. What happened over the next several hours is something I reconstructed later from Nora's account, my parents' messages, the hospital paperwork, and eventually their own admissions. Nora started coughing sometime after lunch. My parents had been doing yard work with the windows open, and something in the air bothered her. At first, it was mild. She coughed, felt tightness in her chest, and went to the front pocket of her backpack. My mother saw her reaching for the inhaler and took it from her hand. Nora told me later that she said, "Grandma, I need it." Mom told her she was getting herself worked up. "She's just being dramatic," she said to my father. "If she calms down, she'll be fine." Nora asked again. Mom told her to sit at the kitchen table, drink some water, and slow her breathing. Dad was there. He did not give the inhaler back. The worst part was that for a short while, Nora did appear better. Resting helped. The coughing eased. She could talk normally again. That little improvement gave my mother exactly what she wanted. Confirmation. Instead of seeing it as temporary, she treated it as proof that she had diagnosed the situation better than Nora or me. Around 2 that afternoon, Dad texted me. "She got a little worked up, but she's fine now." That was all he wrote. If he had told me she had asked for her inhaler, I would have been in my car before finishing the message. If he had told me Mom had taken it away, I would have called him immediately and told him to hand it back. Instead, he gave me a sentence designed to make the situation sound finished. I was completing an errand and expected to pick Nora up later that afternoon, so I sent back a simple message asking him to call me if anything changed. Things changed. Nora's chest tightened again. The wheezing returned. She asked for her inhaler a second time. Mom refused again because, in her mind, giving it back after Nora had calmed down once would prove that Nora could get what she wanted by becoming frightened. Dad had already moved Nora's backpack away from the kitchen after she kept reaching for it. I did not know that yet. At the time, all I knew was that nobody called me. By late afternoon, Nora was tired from working to breathe. She could no longer comfortably finish a full sentence without stopping. Dad finally began to realize this was not the same situation they had convinced themselves they were managing. But by then, returning the inhaler meant admitting that they had deliberately kept it from her for hours. Calling me meant explaining why. They waited longer. That decision was the one my father would spend the next several weeks trying to rename. Nora eventually collapsed. My father called emergency services. I learned something was wrong when he finally called me and said an ambulance was taking Nora to the hospital. He did not tell me why she had not used her inhaler earlier. He only said her asthma had suddenly gotten bad. I remember driving to the hospital with both hands locked around the steering wheel and forcing myself not to imagine the worst. The trip normally took less than half an hour. That day, every traffic light felt personal. By the time I reached the emergency department, Nora had received treatment and was breathing more comfortably, but she looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Her face was pale. Her hair was stuck to her forehead. She looked small under the hospital blanket. I sat beside her and held her hand until she stopped watching the doorway. When she was calm enough to talk, I asked only what I needed to know. "Where was your inhaler?" "Grandma took it." "Did you ask for it back?" Nora nodded. Then she said something that made me look up. Grandpa knew where she put it. I did not ask her 10 more questions. I did not make her repeat herself until the story sounded neat. I told her she had done the right thing by asking for her medicine, and that none of this was her fault. Then, I stepped into the hallway and spoke to the clinician and the hospital social worker who were already documenting what had happened. I gave them facts. Nora had arrived at my parents' house with her prescribed rescue medication. She had asked for it. My mother had taken it from her. My father had been present. Her symptoms had worsened, and she had required emergency treatment. The hospital staff told me they would handle their reporting responsibilities on their side. Then I made one call of my own. I called the local police non-emergency line and asked to make an incident report. I was not demanding that anyone arrest my parents. I was not claiming they had tried to kill my daughter. I wanted a record created while the facts were fresh, before anybody had time to turn "Susan took the inhaler" into "the inhaler went missing." An officer took the initial information and gave me a report number. Later that evening, while Nora was still being observed, the officer contacted my parents for preliminary statements. Nora was discharged after several hours once the doctors were satisfied that she was stable. I took her home, settled her upstairs, and checked on her twice before I heard pounding at the front door. My father stood on the porch with his jaw tight and his face flushed. "What did you tell them?" I stared at him. Not "how is she?" Not "is Nora okay?" I told him the truth. I told them what happened. He lowered his voice. "Did you tell them your mother took it? Or did you say nobody could find it?" That question chilled me more than the pounding had, because I had never told him anyone was claiming the inhaler had simply been lost. And suddenly my father was not asking what happened. He was asking which version had made it outside the family. The next morning, Nora slept later than usual, and I let her. I had been awake since before sunrise anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with my phone, the hospital discharge papers, and a legal pad spread in front of me. I kept replaying my father's question from the night before. Not how Nora was doing, not whether she was still scared. What did you tell them? By 7:30, I had stopped trying to convince myself he had only been panicking. Whatever else I learned later, one thing was already clear. My parents were not going to be alone with my daughter again. I sent them both the same message. I kept it short because I did not want anger creating language I would regret later. Nora would have no unsupervised contact with either of them. They were not to discuss her asthma, her medication, or what had happened with her directly. For the time being, all communication with me needed to be in writing. I added that I would let them know if and when those boundaries changed. I did not ask whether they agreed. Mom called before I had even put the phone down. I let it ring. She called again. Then Dad called. I ignored that one too. Mom's first text arrived less than a minute later. "You are punishing us while everyone is still emotional." I wrote back, "I'm making a safety decision for Nora. I'm not discussing it by phone." She replied immediately, "Safety? Your father called the ambulance. That sentence told me more than she intended. She had already moved past whether withholding the inhaler was wrong. In her mind, Dad calling for help later canceled what they had done earlier. I did not answer. I had spent too many years in arguments where Mom treated every explanation as an invitation to keep negotiating until the original issue disappeared. Nora came downstairs around 9 wearing pajamas and carrying her blanket over one shoulder. She looked tired but more like herself. I made her toast and sat beside her while she ate. I did not bring up my parents. I wanted at least one morning where she did not have to explain herself. She brought them up first. Mom? Yeah? Was I really panicking yesterday? I looked at her. What makes you ask that? Grandma said I was making it worse because I got scared. Maybe if I stayed calmer, I wouldn't have needed the inhaler. There it was, the part that frightened me more than any argument my mother could have had with me. I chose my words carefully. Getting scared can make breathing feel harder, but when your asthma plan says to use your inhaler and you know you need it, asking for it is the right thing to do. Nora stared at the edge of her plate. So I wasn't being dramatic? No. Even if I was scared? Even if you were scared? She nodded, but I could tell she was still working through it. That made me angry in a way I did not let her see. My mother had not only taken medication away from her, she had managed to leave a 9-year-old wondering whether needing help was a character flaw. Around noon, my cousin Melissa texted me. I don't want to get in the middle, but Aunt Susan is a mess. She says Nora had a panic attack. They tried to calm her down, and then the inhaler got misplaced. She says you're calling it abuse. I read the message twice. I had never used the word abuse with my mother. I had never told Melissa anything. I called her, not because I wanted family gossip, but because I needed to know exactly what was being said. Melissa sounded uncomfortable. Your mom said Nora got worked up and kept reaching for the inhaler, so she tried to get her to slow down first. Then nobody could find it when she needed it later. Nobody could find it? That's what she said. Did she say she took it from Nora? There was a pause. No. I thanked Melissa and ended the call. That was the first time I heard the story change outside my parents' house. By early afternoon, Dad sent an email. Not a text. An email. That was how my father handled anything he wanted to sound reasonable about. The subject line was, for clarity. He wrote that Saturday had been frightening for everyone. He said Nora had become anxious after coughing. Mom had tried to calm her, and the medication could not be located immediately when her symptoms later worsened. He said he regretted that I had been frightened and understood why I was reacting strongly as her mother. He asked me not to make permanent family decisions while emotions were high. Then he added, it was never hidden from her. I stopped reading. I went back to that sentence. It was never hidden from her. I had not accused Dad of hiding anything in writing. My message that morning said no unsupervised contact. The hospital had documented that Mom took the inhaler. Nora had said, Grandpa knew where she put it. Even the police report I gave had been factual. Dad was denying a word I had never used with him. I printed the email. That sounds excessive until you understand what I did for a living. When something went wrong in operations, memory was the first thing people trusted too much. Everybody remembered the same meeting differently. Everybody thought they had sent the email, checked the box, warned somebody else, so I stopped relying on memory. I took out a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Saturday. I added the approximate time I dropped Nora off. The text from Dad saying she had gotten a little worked up but was fine. The time he called me about the ambulance. The hospital arrival. Nora's statement about Mom taking the inhaler. Dad's visit to my house. His question about whether I had said Mom took it or nobody could find it. Then I added Sunday. Mom. I was punishing them. Melissa. Mom was telling relatives the inhaler had been misplaced. Dad. Medication could not be located immediately. Dad again, it was never hidden from her. I sat there looking at the page and felt something shift. Up until then, I had been thinking about Saturday as one terrible decision followed by panic. My mother took the inhaler. My father failed to stop her. Nora got worse. They panicked. People lie when they panic. But this did not feel like panic anymore. This felt organized. I still did not know what Dad was protecting. I did not even know whether Mom and Dad were telling the same version to everyone. What I knew was that the language was changing fast, and every change made their actions sound less deliberate. I saved screenshots of the messages and backed up the email. I did not post them. I did not send them to a family group chat. I did not call my mother and demand she explain herself. That would have given Dad exactly what he wanted. Another emotional conversation he could later summarize however he liked. Instead, I kept the record. That evening, Mom texted again. "Your father and I have apologized for how frightening yesterday became. What more do you want?" I stared at the word apologized. Neither of them had apologized for taking the inhaler. Dad had apologized that I was frightened. Mom had apologized that things became frightening. Nobody had apologized for the decision that caused it. I typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. Finally, I wrote, "I want Nora safe. The boundaries stand." Mom did not reply. Dad did. "Please don't let outside people turn this into something it wasn't." I felt that sentence in my stomach. Outside people. The hospital. The police officer. Anyone who was not family. For the first time, I wondered whether Dad was afraid of more than Saturday. Late that night, after Nora was asleep, my phone lit up with a text from a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name at the bottom. Diane. My mother's younger sister. The aunt I had barely spoken to in years. The woman my parents had spent most of my childhood describing as dramatic, intrusive, and incapable of leaving other people's families alone. Her message was only one line. "Ask your father what happened at Briarwood Elementary when you were 9. I did not answer Diane that night. I read her message 3 times, saved a screenshot, and put my phone face down on the table. For most of my life, my aunt had existed in family stories more than in my actual life. According to my mother, Diane interfered in everything, exaggerated every problem, and had once nearly destroyed our family because she could not respect boundaries. According to my father, she had always been too emotional to know when to stop. I had heard those descriptions so often that by adulthood I no longer questioned where they came from. Briarwood Elementary was different. I knew that name. I had gone there until 5th grade. What I did not understand was why seeing it in Diane's message made the back of my neck tighten before I could attach a memory to it. I went upstairs, checked Nora, then stood in the hallway longer than I needed to. She was sleeping normally, one arm curled beneath her pillow. Her backpack sat outside her bedroom because I had emptied and cleaned it after the hospital. The front pocket was open. For a moment I saw something else instead of our hallway. A blue vinyl chair, a white paper cup crushed between small hands. The smell of disinfectant sharp enough to sting my nose. Then my Aunt Diane sitting beside me. The memory came in pieces, not like a hidden door suddenly opening. I had always remembered being in an emergency room as a child. I just remembered it inside the story my parents had given me afterward. Diane had panicked. Diane had scared everyone. Diane had taken me for treatment when I did not really need it. Mom had cried because her sister had turned a manageable problem into a crisis. I remembered Dad standing near the foot of the bed. I remembered him being angry. Most clearly, I remembered him telling me, "Look what your aunt made happen." For 30 years, that sentence had decided what the memory meant. The next morning, I waited until Nora was at home resting with me and occupied with a movie before I called Diane. I did not begin by accusing my parents of anything. I did not tell her what I thought had happened. I wanted to hear what she would say without feeding her the answer. She picked up after the second ring. "Megan?" Her voice sounded older than I remembered, but I recognized it immediately. "What happened at Briarwood?" There was a long silence. Then she said, "Did something happen to Nora?" That question made me sit straighter. Why would you ask that? Because Susan doesn't change the things she thinks she's right about. I felt irritation rise before I could stop it. That's not an answer. You're right. Diane took a breath. You were 9. There was some kind of outdoor activity at school that day. Your asthma had been bothering you more that spring. Susan had started saying you were reaching for your inhaler too quickly whenever you felt tightness in your chest. I did not interrupt. She took it out of your bag that morning. My fingers tightened around the phone. You saw her do that? No, she admitted it later. That mattered to me. Diane continued. The school tried to reach her after you started having trouble breathing. For whatever reason, they couldn't get her immediately. I was still listed as one of your emergency contacts then. They called me. By the time I got there, you were scared and struggling enough that I wasn't going to sit around arguing about whether you were being dramatic. Something cold moved through my stomach. You took me to the hospital. Yes, my parents told me you overreacted. I know. They said you scared me into thinking I couldn't breathe. Diane was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, Megan, you were already having trouble breathing when I arrived. I looked toward the living room, where I could hear Nora laughing softly at something on television. The similarities were so obvious that my mind resisted them. Why didn't you tell me any of this? I did. When you were older. Or I tried. I don't remember that. No. Because I stopped being around long before you were old enough for a real conversation. That answer angered me more than I expected. So you knew something was wrong, and you left. I did. There was no excuse in her voice. I fought with Susan for months. I fought with your father too. I kept telling myself I was protecting you by pushing. Eventually, every visit became a war, and your parents made it clear that if I kept accusing Susan of taking your medication, I wouldn't see you at all. Then I reached a point where I was tired of fighting people who had already decided I was the problem. You gave up. Yes. The simplicity of her answer disarmed me. I told myself you would grow up and figure things out someday, she said. That was easier than admitting I wanted my own life back. I did not forgive her in that moment. I appreciated that she did not ask me to. Before we ended the call, I asked one more question. Did my father know Mom took the inhaler? Yes. You're sure? I'm sure. I wrote the answer down but did not treat it as fact yet. Diane's memory was still one person's memory. I had spent too much of my life living inside other people's certainty to replace one version with another just because the new version hurt more. That afternoon, Mom called. I almost let it go to voicemail, then decided I wanted to hear what she would say before anyone told her I had spoken to Diane. She did not bother with small talk. Has my sister contacted you? I looked at my phone screen. How do you know she would? Because Diane lives for this kind of thing. She sees one family disagreement, and suddenly she's back playing rescuer. I had not told Mom Diane had messaged me. Melissa did not know. As far as I knew, nobody did. I asked, what happened at Briarwood when I was 9? Silence. Not confusion. Silence. Then Mom said, so she has contacted you. That wasn't my question. You had asthma problems as a child. Diane got involved where she didn't belong. Did you take my inhaler out of my bag? Mom sighed with the same exhausted tone she used when she thought I was intentionally missing something obvious. Megan, you were using that inhaler every time you got scared. I felt the answer before I consciously understood it. Did you take it? You relied on it too much. That is still not an answer. You're doing exactly what Diane always did. You take one decision and make it sound sinister because you don't want to understand the reason behind it. I stared at the notes in front of me. She had been given 3 chances to say no. She had not used one of them. Mom, I'm not asking why. Her voice hardened. I was your mother. I knew you better than Diane did. And Nora knew she needed her inhaler Saturday. That is completely different. Why? Because you've taught her to panic. There it was again. Same word. Same argument. Same age. I ended the call before she could turn the conversation into a debate about my parenting. For several minutes, I sat in silence. I still did not know exactly what had happened in 1996. I had Diane's account. I had fragments of my own memory. I had Mom refusing to deny taking my inhaler. That was enough to change the question, but not enough for me to pretend I knew everything. An hour later, Diane texted me again. I know you have no reason to trust my memory over theirs. I wouldn't either. Then another message appeared. But I kept one thing. I called her immediately. What? A letter your father sent me after Briarwood. My throat tightened. Why would you still have it? Because it was the letter that made me stop coming back. I looked down at the timeline I had started after Nora's collapse. For the first time, the line did not seem to begin last Saturday. Send it to me, I said. Diane paused. Are you sure you want to read it? Yes. She exhaled slowly. Then you need to understand something first. Your mother was the one who took your inhaler. But your father was the reason nobody was allowed to say it out loud. Diane sent the letter that afternoon. It came as 3 photographs because the paper was old and too fragile to keep unfolding. The edges had yellowed, One corner was bent, and Kenneth's handwriting looked almost painfully familiar. I had seen that same neat block lettering on birthday cards, tax envelopes, labels in the garage, notes taped to the refrigerator. For most of my life, that handwriting had meant order, reliability, my father making sure everyone knew where things belonged. I opened the first image and read it twice before I moved to the second. The letter did not contain some dramatic confession. Dad did not write. Susan took Megan's inhaler, and I helped cover it up. He was too careful for that, even 30 years ago. What he wrote was worse in a quieter way. He told Diane she had no right to keep telling people that Mom had taken Megan's medication away. He accused her of turning a private parenting decision into a public spectacle. He said she had involved the school and doctors unnecessarily, frightened me, embarrassed Mom, and made the situation harder than it needed to be. Then came the sentence Diane had remembered all these years. If she continued repeating that accusation to relatives, school staff, or anyone else, she would no longer be welcome around me. I stared at that line until the words blurred. Dad never denied the thing he was threatening her for saying. That was what mattered. He did not write. Susan never took the medication. He wrote, "Stop telling people she did." I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the photographs enlarged on the screen. For several minutes, I did what I had always done when evidence pointed somewhere I did not want to go. I looked for another explanation. Maybe Dad had been angry. Maybe Diane had exaggerated something in another conversation. Maybe Mom had moved the inhaler for some innocent reason, and Diane had used harsher language. Maybe Dad had simply wanted the family conflict to stop. I knew I was doing it, and I still could not stop. That was one of my flaws, long before I understood it as a flaw. I had spent years believing fairness meant refusing to reach a conclusion, until every possible alternative had been eliminated. At work, that made me careful. At home, it often meant people got more chances to explain away behavior I would never have tolerated from anyone else. I called Diane back. "Did he ever tell you Mom didn't take it?" "No." "Did he ever say you misunderstood?" "No." "What did he say?" "That I was making Susan look like a bad mother over one mistake." I closed my eyes. Diane continued before I could ask anything else. "Your father's position was never that it didn't happen. His position was that nobody outside the family needed to know." "Why?" "Because he thought protecting Susan protected the family." There was no triumph in Diane's voice. If anything, she sounded tired. I asked her to tell me exactly what happened after the hospital that day in 1996. She said Mom was furious that Diane had taken me for treatment without waiting for her. Dad was less explosive, but more deliberate. He told Diane that Susan had made a judgment call, that parents were allowed to make mistakes, and that continuing to talk about it would confuse me and damage my trust in my mother. Then he began changing the language. Mom had not taken my inhaler. She had held onto it. Then she had put it somewhere else. Then the school had overreacted. Then Diane had panicked. By the time the story reached me, the only person who had done something wrong was Diane. I looked again at the old letter. It suddenly sounded exactly like the email Dad had sent after Nora's collapse. 30 years apart, and the structure was almost identical. Back then, don't let one parenting decision define Susan. Now, don't let one frightening afternoon define your mother. Back then, Diane involved outsiders. Now, Megan is letting outside people turn this into something it wasn't. Back then, Susan's action became a misunderstanding. Now, the inhaler could not be located immediately. I printed Dad's recent email and placed it beside the photographs Diane had sent me. The resemblance was not in the exact words. It was in the method. Mom did something dangerous. Dad made the danger smaller. Someone objected. Dad made the objection the problem. Then he positioned himself in the middle, calm and reasonable, while everyone else became emotional. I had spent most of my childhood believing he was the safe parent because he rarely yelled. That belief was getting harder to defend. Later that day, Nora came into the kitchen, wearing socks on the hardwood floor and carrying her backpack. She had been better physically since the hospital, though I was still watching her more closely than usual. I tried not to make that obvious. She put the backpack on a chair and hesitated. "What's wrong?" I asked. "My chest feels a little weird." I stood, but I did not rush at her. Okay, what do you need to do? Her hand moved toward the front pocket, then stopped. I don't know. That scared me more than I wanted her to see. Before Saturday, Nora had never hesitated about this. She knew the routine. She knew where her inhaler was. She knew to tell an adult. She had been proud of knowing. Now she looked at the zipper and asked, "What if I'm just nervous?" I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You might be nervous." She frowned. "And if you are, that doesn't mean your asthma isn't real." She looked at me carefully. "What if I use it when I don't need it? We follow your asthma plan. We don't guess based on whether somebody thinks you're being dramatic." Her eyes dropped. I hated that word now. I asked, "What did Grandma tell you Saturday?" Nora rubbed her thumb against the backpack strap. She said if I kept reaching for it, I'd never learn that I could calm myself down. There it was. My mother had not only withheld medication, she had turned needing help into a failure of character. I kept my voice steady. If your body is telling you something is wrong, you tell an adult. If your plan says you need your inhaler, you use it. Nobody gets to shame you for that. Even Grandma? Even Grandma! She opened the front pocket and checked the inhaler herself. I did not take it out for her. That mattered to me. I wanted Nora to understand that the medicine belonged in her control, not mine, not Susan's, not anyone else's. That evening, Dad texted me, "I'd like to talk without your mother there." I read the message and felt an old instinct rise in me. Relief. For most of my life, private conversations with Dad had been where I went when Mom was too much. He was the one who softened things, explained things, told me what she had really meant. Part of me wanted him to say what I had been waiting to hear. Susan was wrong. I should have stopped her. You were right to protect Nora. Then another message appeared. You're right about your mother, but you're wrong about me. I looked at the old letter still lying beside my computer. 30 years earlier, my father had threatened Diane for telling the truth about Mom. Now he wanted to separate himself from the same truth. I agreed to meet him, but for the first time in my life, I was not going to that conversation, hoping my father would explain my mother to me. I was going to find out whether the man I had always considered the safer parent had ever actually been safe at all. I met my father 3 days later at a coffee shop halfway between my house and his. I chose the place because it was public, busy enough that neither of us could turn the conversation into a scene, and far enough from Nora that I would not spend the entire time worrying about who might show up at my door. Dad arrived early, which was typical. He had already bought coffee for both of us and chosen a table in the back corner. For years, small gestures like that had been part of why I thought of him as the reasonable one. Mom pushed. Dad smoothed things over. Mom raised her voice. Dad lowered his. I used to confuse calmness with safety. He looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier. His shoulders were rounded, and there were dark circles under his eyes. When I sat down, he slid the cup toward me and said, "I'm glad you came." I said I would. He nodded, then stared at the lid of his coffee. "Your mother was wrong." Those were the words I had wanted from him since the hospital. I felt something inside me loosen before I could stop it. Dad continued, "She should never have taken Nora's inhaler. I told her that afterward. I've told her more than once since then." I did not interrupt. "I should have stopped it sooner," he said. "I should have stepped in harder. I know that." For a few seconds, he sounded exactly like the father I had hoped was still there. Not innocent, not perfect, but capable of admitting that Mom had crossed a line. Then I noticed the shape of his apology. Sooner, harder. He was not saying he had participated. He was saying he had failed to control someone else. "What happened after Mom took it?" I asked. He looked up. "You already know. I know pieces. I want to hear it from you." Dad sighed. Nora started coughing. Susan thought she was getting anxious and making it worse. She took the inhaler because she wanted her to settle down first. "And you?" "I didn't think it was a good idea." "What did you do?" "I told Susan not to push her too far." That was not an answer. "What did you do when Nora asked for it back?" Dad rubbed his thumb against the side of his cup. "It happened quickly." "No, it happened over hours." His jaw tightened. "She seemed better for a while," he said. "That's what you need to understand." She calmed down. She was talking normally again. Susan thought that proved she had been right about the anxiety. Did you think Mom was right? I thought maybe she had a point. That was the first honest sentence of the meeting. Dad immediately softened it. Not about withholding medication, about Nora feeding the fear. I kept my voice even. Did you give the inhaler back? No. Why? Because Susan had it. That isn't why. He looked toward the window. I didn't want to start a fight in front of Nora. There it was. The phrase Dad had used my entire childhood. I did not want to make things worse. I did not want to create a scene. I was trying to keep everyone calm. His decisions always sounded passive even when they changed what happened next. Where was Nora's backpack? He looked back at me. I don't remember. You told me you weren't involved. If you weren't involved, that should be easy. Megan, I was moving around the house. I wasn't documenting every object. Who moved the backpack away from the kitchen? He stared at me a second too long. I don't know. That answer bothered me more than a flat denial would have. I changed direction. When did you decide Nora needed emergency help? When she got worse? When? Later. Before she collapsed? Yes. How long before? Dad leaned back. I came here to take responsibility, not sit through an interrogation. I'm asking you what you're taking responsibility for. His expression changed slightly. Not anger exactly. Frustration that I was making him define his own apology. He lowered his voice. I should have called you earlier. I should have told Susan to give the inhaler back. I should have realized sooner that Nora was not just anxious. Did Nora ask you directly for it? He hesitated. I think she did. What did you tell her? I don't remember the exact words. I watched him carefully. My father remembered exact wording when the wording helped him. He had remembered enough to tell relatives the inhaler could not be located immediately. He had remembered enough to email me that it was never hidden. Now he suddenly could not remember what he had said. To a 9-year-old who was asking for medicine. I let the silence sit. Eventually, Dad said, "This is why I wanted to talk alone." I already knew what was coming. He leaned forward. Your mother made the decision. She took the inhaler. I failed to stop her. Those are not the same thing. I didn't say they were. But you're treating us the same. You were both responsible for Nora. That doesn't make me responsible for every decision Susan made. No, your decisions make you responsible for your decisions. His mouth tightened. Then his tone changed, softer, almost wounded. Megan, I'm willing to tell anyone what happened. I'll tell the officer. I'll tell the hospital. I'll tell whoever you want. Susan took the inhaler. I didn't agree with her. There was a pause before the next part. But I need you to be fair about my role. I waited. I need you to tell them I never withheld medication from Nora. My stomach sank. There it was. The price. Dad was not giving me truth. He was offering a version in exchange for protection. I can't tell anyone that. Why not? Because I don't know whether it's true. His face hardened. You know I would never hurt Nora. I know you don't think you would. That is not the same thing. No, it isn't. He sat back and crossed his arms. I'm her grandfather. Yes. I love that little girl. I believe you. Then why are you acting like I'm dangerous? Because love was not the question. That realization landed so clearly that I almost said it out loud. Instead, I asked, what do you want? He looked surprised. What? What do you want from me in exchange for this conversation? I don't want anything in exchange. Then why are we discussing whether I'll tell people you didn't participate? Dad's eyes shifted. Finally, he said, I want to see Nora. There it was. I understand. Supervised, if that's what you need for now. No. His face changed. You won't even consider it? Not based on this conversation. Megan, I'm trying to do the right thing. If telling the truth is the right thing, then tell it without asking me to pay you with access to my daughter. Dad stared at me. For the first time since I sat down, he looked angry. I came here because I thought you were capable of separating facts from emotion. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. I am. Then separate me from your mother. Give me facts that let me do that. His jaw tightened again. I reached into my bag and took out a printed copy of the photographs Diane had sent me. I placed them between us. Dad looked down. The color left his face before he picked up the first page. You've been talking to Diane? Yes. She has been waiting 30 years for a chance to do this. Did you write the letter? Dad did not answer immediately. Did you write it? Yes. Did you know Mom had taken my inhaler when I was 9? His fingers remained on the paper. It was more complicated than Diane makes it sound. That's not my question. He exhaled. Yes, I knew. The coffee shop seemed louder around us. I had already suspected it. I had the letter. I had Diane's account. Mom had refused to deny it. Still, hearing Dad say it changed something. Why did you threaten to keep Diane away from me if she told people? I did not threaten her. I tapped the page. You told her she wouldn't be allowed around me because she was tearing the family apart. She took me to get medical care. She turned one bad decision into a war. One bad decision. Dad leaned toward me. You were a child. You didn't need adults dragging you into conflict. Your mother made a mistake. Diane wanted to make that mistake the only thing anyone saw when they looked at Susan. So you told me Diane was the problem. I protected you. From what? From believing your mother was dangerous. The answer hit harder than if he had shouted. I stared at him. Was she? Dad's face changed. For a second, there was no polished response. Then he said, Your mother loved you. That wasn't my question. You keep asking questions, as if one answer defines an entire person. I looked down at the old letter, then back at him. That was his philosophy. Susan was never allowed to be defined by what she did. Diane had been defined by how she reacted. I had been defined as dramatic because I was scared. And now, Nora was being defined the same way because she had asked for her inhaler. I gathered the papers. Dad said, So that's it? You've already decided I'm guilty of whatever Diane says? No. I put the letter back into my bag. That's the difference between us. I'm not deciding anything I can't support. Then support what I'm telling you. I will support every part that holds up. And if I tell the officer, Susan took the inhaler, I'll say you told him. And you still won't let me see Nora? Not until I understand what you actually did. His expression went cold. You've changed. Maybe I had. Or maybe I had finally stopped accepting calm words as evidence of good intentions. I left before he could turn the meeting into another negotiation. For the next several days, Dad sent nothing. Mom sent enough for both of them. But I did not engage beyond what was necessary. Nora was recovering physically, though she still checked my face sometimes before reaching for her inhaler, as if she needed permission to trust herself. Every time she did, I reminded myself why none of this could be settled just because my father had finally admitted my mother was wrong. Near the end of that week, an email arrived from the ambulance service responding to my records request. The fuller EMS narrative was attached. I read it slowly. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Nora's condition when the crew arrived, treatment during transport, times, observations. Then I reached a line about her rescue medication. When responders asked whether Nora had an inhaler, Kenneth provided it from a kitchen drawer. I read the sentence again. The record did not say Dad had hidden it. It did not say when he learned where it was. It did not say what he had been thinking. It said something narrower. When the ambulance arrived and somebody asked for the inhaler, my father knew where to get it. At the coffee shop, he had spent an hour describing himself as a man who failed to stop Susan. Now I had a different question. Not whether he knew where the inhaler was by the time Nora collapsed. How long had he known? I did not call my father the moment I finished reading the EMS narrative. That would have been the old version of me. The one who believed every new fact had to be confronted immediately or it might somehow lose its value. Instead, I printed the page, highlighted the line about the inhaler, and put it beside the timeline I had been building since the hospital. The record proved one narrow thing. When the paramedics asked for Nora's rescue inhaler, Dad was the person who produced it from a kitchen drawer. It did not tell me when he learned it was there. It did not tell me who put it there. It did not tell me what had happened during the hours before the ambulance arrived. I was determined not to turn a fact into a conclusion, just because the conclusion frightened me. That evening, Nora was sitting at the dining table working on a science worksheet when I finally asked the question I had been avoiding. She had been doing better physically, but I was careful about how often I brought up that Saturday. I did not want every quiet moment in our house to become another interview. Can I ask you one thing about Grandma and Grandpa's house? She looked up from her pencil. Okay, you don't have to try to remember anything you're not sure about. Do you remember what happened to your backpack after Grandma took the inhaler? Nora frowned and stared at the page for a few seconds. Grandpa moved it. My stomach tightened. Where? I don't know. Away from me. Do you remember why? She nodded slowly. I kept going to it. I waited. Grandma told me to stop checking for the inhaler because I was making myself more nervous. Grandpa picked the backpack up and took it somewhere else. Did he say anything? He said to listen to Grandma. I kept my face still, though every instinct in me wanted to push further. Do you remember seeing where he took it? No. That's okay. She looked at me nervously. Am I in trouble because I kept trying to get it? The question hurt more than the answer had. No, you were trying to get your medicine. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Nora looked relieved, then returned to her worksheet. I did not ask her what Dad's expression had been, or whether he seemed worried, or exactly how many times she had asked him for help. I already had what I needed from that conversation, and I refused to turn my daughter's memory into something I mined until it produced the version I wanted. After she went upstairs, I sat at the table alone and let myself feel something I had been holding back since the hospital. Guilt. I had trusted my father more than my mother. Even after years of watching him excuse her behavior, I had still thought of him as the person who would step in if something truly dangerous happened. He might avoid arguments, he might minimize things afterward, but somewhere in my mind there had always been a line I believed he would not cross. Nora had asked him for help. He had moved the bag away. For several minutes, my thoughts turned on me. I should have known. I should have taken Mom's comments more seriously. I should never have left Nora there. Then I stopped. I had to stop, because there was a difference between accountability and punishment. And I had spent too many years watching my parents blur that difference whenever it benefited them. Before that Saturday, Mom had said things I disliked. She had never taken Nora's medication. Dad had never helped her do it. I had made a decision based on the information I had then. Now I had different information, and I had already changed my decision. That mattered. I was not going to spend the rest of the story blaming myself for trusting people who had worked hard to appear trustworthy. My responsibility was what I did after I learned the truth. The next morning, I sent Dad a single message. The EMS report says you were the person who gave paramedics Nora's inhaler from the kitchen drawer. At the coffee shop, you said you didn't know what Susan had done with it. Explain the difference. He called immediately. I did not answer. 10 minutes later, a text appeared. I never said I didn't know where it was at the end. I read it twice. At the end, another carefully chosen phrase. I wrote back, "When did you know?" There was no response for nearly an hour. Then, I knew where Susan put it by then. That doesn't mean I agreed with her. I stared at the screen. He had just given me another piece. Not everything, but another piece. I replied, "When is by then?" Dad wrote, "Megan, you are turning every imperfect decision into evidence of some conspiracy." I did not engage with that. I sent one more question. Did you move Nora's backpack after she tried to get her inhaler? This time the silence lasted until afternoon. His eventual answer was not a denial. I moved the bag because she kept fixating on it and Susan was trying to calm her down. I sat back from the table. There it was. For weeks, Dad had been describing himself as a man who failed to intervene. Now, in his own words, he had admitted that he moved the bag because Nora was trying to reach the medication Mom had taken from her. He did not have to agree with Susan's reasoning to participate in enforcing it. I saved the message and added it to the timeline. EMS narrative. Dad produced inhaler from kitchen drawer. Nora. Dad moved backpack when she kept reaching for it. Dad. I moved the bag because Susan was trying to calm her down. 3 separate pieces. None of them depended on me guessing what he was thinking. That afternoon, Mom called. I let it go to voicemail. Then she texted, "Your father says you are accusing him of hiding Nora's inhaler." I had not told her that. I wrote, "I asked him what he did." Her response came so quickly that I could almost feel her anger through the screen. "He was there. Stop letting him pretend this was all me." I read that sentence slowly. For the first time, Mom was not trying to protect the United version. She was trying to protect herself from Dad's version. I did not respond immediately. Another message arrived. He agreed she needed to calm down. Then another. He acts like I made every decision by myself because he thinks you'll forgive him if he throws me under the bus. I saved all 3. Mom called again. This time I answered, "What do you mean he agreed?" She let out a sharp breath. "You've been talking to him privately, haven't you?" "Yes. Of course you have. Kenneth always does this. He waits until I'm the bad guy and then shows up looking reasonable." That sentence almost made me laugh because it was the first thing Mom had said in weeks that matched my own experience perfectly. What did he agree to? He agreed Nora was getting worked up. That isn't what I asked. He agreed we should give her time. How much time? Mom went quiet. I heard a cabinet close somewhere in the background. Mom? I am not letting you interrogate me while your father plays innocent. I'm asking about Nora. And I'm telling you he was there. I kept my voice calm. Did he know you had taken the inhaler? Yes. The answer came instantly. Did he know where it was? Another pause. He knew enough. That was not precise enough for me. What does that mean? It means he knew what was happening. I heard another voice in the background, low and sharp. Dad. Mom must have turned away from the phone because her next words were muffled. Then Dad's voice came through clearly. Who are you talking to? Mom answered him, the person you're blaming me to. There was movement, then Dad's voice closer to the phone. Susan, hang up. She snapped back. Why? So you can call her later and tell her you were helpless? I did not say anything. For once, I did not need to. They had spent years operating as a team. Mom made the hard claim. Dad softened it. Mom pushed. Dad translated. Together they produced one clean family story. Now they were producing two. Dad said, "You're making this worse." Mom laughed bitterly. That's what you always say when you don't want to admit what you did. The call disconnected. A minute later, Dad texted me. Do not take anything your mother says while she's angry as fact. I looked at the message and thought about how many times he had taught me exactly that lesson. Mom was emotional. Diane was dramatic. I was overreacting. Nora was panicking. Dad was always the calm one, which somehow meant his version was supposed to count more. I did not answer him. That night, I added one more section to my timeline. Not facts. Contradiction. Dad, Susan made the decision. Mom, he was there. Dad, I did not agree. Mom, he agreed Nora needed to calm down. Dad. I moved the bag only because Susan was trying to calm her. Nora. Grandpa moved my backpack after I kept reaching for it. I was beginning to understand something important. My parents' story had survived for decades because they usually protected each other before they protected the truth. The moment Dad tried to save himself by separating his role from Mom's, he created the one thing their system could not tolerate. Competition. The next morning, I woke to 7 messages from Mom. The first 6 were variations of the same argument. Dad was rewriting the afternoon to make her look solely responsible. The 7th was different. It was one sentence. Ask him whose idea it was to give her another 20 minutes. Mom's message sat on my screen for almost a full minute before I answered. What do you mean? I did not ask whether she was telling the truth. I did not tell her what Dad had already admitted. I had learned that the less I supplied, the more clearly both of them revealed themselves. Her reply came a few minutes later. When Nora started wheezing again, I said maybe we should give the inhaler back. Your father said she had settled down once already, and we should give it another 20 minutes. I read the message twice. Then another appeared. He said if we rushed every time she got scared, we were proving your point for you. That sentence made me stop. Not because it sounded like Dad, because it sounded exactly like the system I had spent weeks uncovering. Mom wanted to prove Nora did not need the inhaler. Dad wanted to prove that giving in too quickly would reinforce whatever he had decided was fear. Different justifications. Same child. Same delay. I wrote, did Nora ask for the inhaler again during those 20 minutes? Yes. No hesitation that time. What did you tell her? Mom took longer to respond. Finally, she wrote, I told her to sit down and breathe slowly. And Dad? He told her to listen to me. I saved the messages. Then I put my phone down. For weeks, I had been trying to separate intent from action because I wanted to be fair. Mom had believed she was teaching Nora not to panic. Dad had believed he was preventing the situation from becoming a conflict. Neither of them had wanted my daughter to collapse. That mattered in one sense. It did not matter in the sense that had been keeping me trapped. Unsafe did not require evil. I did not need to prove that either of my parents wanted Nora hurt before deciding they could not be trusted with her care. The next message from Mom made her motive even clearer. She was calmer before. That's why I thought I was right. I stared at the words. What did you think you were right about? That she was working herself up and reaching for that inhaler because she's been taught to expect something bad every time she feels tightness. I knew exactly who she meant by she's been taught. May, Mom continued before I could answer. You have made her afraid of her own body. I was trying to show her she could get through it. That was the closest she had come to explaining the decision without hiding behind words like misunderstood or misplaced. She had wanted a demonstration. Nora would ask for the inhaler. Mom would refuse. Nora would calm down. Then Mom would have proof that my parenting was the real problem. The fact that Nora had briefly improved gave her the confirmation she had been waiting for. When the wheezing came back, admitting Nora needed the inhaler would also mean admitting the entire lesson had been wrong. So she doubled down. I typed, and when she got worse? Mom replied. I thought giving it back right then would teach her that panicking worked. I felt anger move through me so quickly that I had to stand up and walk away from the phone. Nora had not been trying to win anything. She had been trying to breathe. I went upstairs and found her sitting cross-legged on her bed with a book. She looked up and smiled at me. What? Nothing. She narrowed her eyes in the way she did when she knew I was checking on her. I'm fine. I know. That word meant something different to me now. I went back downstairs and did not answer Mom for another hour. By then, Dad had sent me an email. The subject line was simply, Susan. He wrote that Mom was angry and rewriting conversations to punish him. He said the idea that he had intentionally prolonged Nora's distress was false. He claimed his only concern had been avoiding unnecessary alarm after Nora appeared to improve. Then he made the mistake I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. I said give it another 20 minutes because she had been breathing better. I stopped there. Mom. Dad said wait another 20 minutes. Dad. I said wait another 20 minutes. They were no longer disagreeing about whether the delay happened. They were arguing about why. I printed the email and placed it next to Mom's messages. Susan said Dad wanted to avoid proving me right. Dad said he wanted to avoid unnecessary alarm. Neither version erased the decision itself. He had known Nora's symptoms had returned. He had known she had already asked for the inhaler. He had still agreed to wait. I wrote him one question. During those 20 minutes, did you know Nora was asking for the inhaler? His answer did not come until the next morning. I knew she wanted it. I did not believe at that point that she was in danger. I read it and added it to the timeline. That was all. I did not ask him whether he loved Nora. I knew he did. I did not ask him whether he had been scared later. I believed he had. Neither fact changed the sequence. A few days later, Diane called. I had told her almost nothing about the new messages, but I asked one question. Did Dad used to say he was just trying to keep everyone calm when I was a kid? Diane gave a humorless laugh. That was his favorite sentence. What did it mean? It meant Susan got to act, and everyone else had to make themselves smaller so she wouldn't have to feel bad about what she did. I looked at the printed email in front of me. Diane continued. Your mother made the first decision at Briarwood. Your father made every decision after it about protecting the first one. That sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly what had happened with Nora. Mom took the inhaler. Dad saw Nora improve temporarily and helped turn that improvement into justification. When the symptoms returned, calling me immediately would have exposed the first decision. Giving the inhaler back would have exposed it too. So instead of correcting the first mistake, they protected it. 20 more minutes. Then more delay. Then an ambulance. Then Dad texting me that Nora had suddenly gotten bad. I used to think family patterns repeated because people forgot the past. Now I understood some patterns repeated because people remembered the past perfectly and had learned the wrong lesson from surviving it. Mom had learned that if she stood by her decision long enough, Dad would help make it sound reasonable. Dad had learned that if he controlled the language afterward, the family could survive almost anything without requiring Susan to admit what she had done. The only difference this time was that I was no longer a 9-year-old sitting in a hospital chair while other adults decided what my memory meant. I had the messages. I had the timeline. And I had a daughter whose safety mattered more than either of my parents' intentions. That was when something in me changed. Until then, Part of me had still been asking whether Dad was truly dangerous, whether Mom had really meant harm, whether cutting them off was too severe, if they had honestly believed Nora was panicking. I stopped asking. Intent might matter if someone was deciding punishment. It did not decide access to my child. I did not need to prove they were monsters. I needed to decide whether they were safe. They were not. The next email from Dad arrived 2 days later. This one was shorter than usual. I'll put everything in writing, no excuses, but I need you to promise me one thing about Nora. I read it once. Then again. My father was finally offering the full truth. And somehow, he was still trying to negotiate the price. Dad's email sat unanswered until the next morning. I already knew what he wanted. He had spent weeks trying to separate himself from Mom because he believed there was still a version of this story where Susan became the reckless one, and he remained the grandfather who had simply failed to act fast enough. If he could convince me of that, he thought he could bargain his way back into Nora's life. I replied with one sentence. Tell the truth first. His answer came almost 3 hours later. It was the longest email he had sent me since the hospital. He began by repeating that Mom had been the one who took Nora's inhaler. He said Nora had started coughing. Susan believed anxiety was making it worse, and she took the inhaler because she wanted Nora to settle down before using it. Dad wrote that he did not like the decision, but he also did not think Nora was in immediate danger at that point. Then he got to the backpack. I moved her bag because she kept reaching for it after Susan told her to stop focusing on the inhaler. I stopped reading. That was the first time Dad had described the action without hiding behind vague language. He moved the bag. Not Susan. Him, he continued. Nora asked me where it was. I told her to listen to her grandmother and give herself a chance to calm down. I read that line twice. For weeks, Dad had described himself as the person who had watched Mom make a bad decision. Now he had written, in his own words, that when Nora asked him for help, he reinforced Mom's refusal. The email went on. Dad said Nora's breathing seemed to improve for a while. He admitted that when the wheezing came back, he suggested waiting longer because he thought they might scare her if they reacted too quickly. I said another 20 minutes because she had been doing better. There it was again. Not Susan's version. His. Then he explained why he did not call me. He wrote that he knew I would come in already angry, take Nora home immediately, and turn the disagreement into a permanent rupture before they had time to understand whether the situation was truly serious. I leaned back in my chair. He had been afraid of my reaction before he had been afraid of Nora's breathing. That was the sequence. Not because he wanted her hurt. Because protecting the family from conflict had become more important to him than admitting they had made a dangerous choice. By the time he realized Nora was deteriorating, he wrote, "Everything happened very fast." That phrase irritated me because almost nothing about that afternoon had happened fast. The collapse happened fast. The decisions leading up to it had taken hours. Dad ended the factual section by admitting that he knew where Mom had put the inhaler before the ambulance arrived. He said he had not believed withholding it would cause serious harm and had trusted Susan's judgment longer than he should have. Then came the part he had really written the email for. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand I am not Susan. I made mistakes. I failed to step in. But I did not make the decision to take the inhaler, and I never wanted Nora hurt. I need you to recognize the difference. I kept reading. If you cannot allow me normal contact right now, I will accept supervision. I will follow whatever medical rules you set. I am asking you not to cut me out of my granddaughter's life because of your mother's decision. I stared at the screen. There it was. Truth as currency. He had finally admitted more because he expected the admission to buy something. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I copied the email into the folder I had created for everything connected to the incident and added the new facts to my timeline. Dad moved the backpack. Dad knew Nora was asking for the inhaler. Dad told her to listen to Mom. Dad suggested another 20 minutes. Dad delayed calling me because he feared my reaction. Dad knew where the inhaler was before the ambulance arrived. None of that required me to interpret his feelings. He had written it himself. That afternoon, I replied, "You told me you would put everything in writing. I appreciate that you did. I am not promising access to Nora in exchange." His response came within minutes. "You are punishing honesty." "No," I wrote. "I'm using honesty to understand what happened." He called twice. I did not answer. Then another email arrived. If I had known telling you the truth would be used against me, I would have spoken differently. I almost laughed. That sentence explained my father better than anything Diane had ever told me. He still believed truth was something you shaped according to what result it produced. I wrote back, "That is exactly the problem." He did not respond. The next day, I asked the question I'd been carrying since Diane sent me the old letter. "Did you know Mom took my inhaler when I was 9? Dad waited until evening. Yes. I stared at the word. One word. 30 years of explanation stripped away. I asked, "Why did you threaten Diane if she told people?" His answer came slowly, in several messages instead of one email. She was escalating everything. She wanted to make Susan look dangerous. Our marriage was already under pressure. You were a child. You did not need to believe your mother was unsafe because of one bad decision. I read them in order. Then I asked, "So you let me believe Diane was the problem?" Dad replied, "I tried to protect the family." There it was. I typed, "By lying?" His response took longer. "By not letting one bad day define your mother." I looked at that sentence until I felt something inside me settle. Dad had spent 30 years believing this was kindness. Mom was allowed to make a dangerous decision without being defined by it. But Diane had been defined as unstable because she objected. I had been defined as dramatic because I was frightened. Now, Nora was being defined as anxious because she asked for medication. Dad protected Susan from being defined by what she did by defining everyone else through how they reacted to it. I wrote, "Your job was never keeping the family together. Your job became keeping Mom from having to face what she did." He called. This time I answered, "Megan, that is not fair." "I think it's exactly fair. You were 9. You don't know what our marriage was like." "You're right. I don't." "Then stop acting like you understand why I made those choices." "I don't need to understand your marriage to know what you told me about Diane wasn't true." Dad exhaled sharply. "Your mother made mistakes. My job was keeping this family together." I closed my eyes. He finally said it aloud. Not just what he did, what he believed. "And Nora?" I asked. "What about her? When she asked you for her inhaler, what family were you keeping together then?" Silence. I continued before he could reshape the question. "You didn't tell me the truth because it was right. You told me because you thought it would buy you something." "That's not true. You asked for access to Nora in the same email. I'm her grandfather. And she asked you for help." He went quiet. I did not need a confession beyond that. "I'm keeping what you wrote," I said. "Exactly as you wrote it." His voice changed. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done arguing over versions." I ended the call. For the first time since Nora collapsed, I felt no urge to chase another answer. Dad had given me enough. Not enough to explain everything he had ever done. Enough to understand the role he had played. The next morning, Mom sent me a message before 7. "He's lying to save himself." I read it without replying. A second message arrived. "If you want the truth, I'll tell you what he did." I looked at Dad's confessions still open on my laptop. For 30 years, my parents had survived by protecting the same story. Now Dad had tried to save himself by handing Mom the blame. Mom was about to answer by handing some of it back. Mom's promise to tell me what he did not make me feel vindicated. It made me tired. By then, I had spent nearly 2 months watching both of my parents insist that the truth depended on which one of them was speaking. I no longer cared who could tell the more convincing story. I cared about what happened to Nora, what each of them knew, and what each of them chose to do after she asked for help. I replied to Mom with one sentence, "Tell me your version in writing." She did. Her first message was almost entirely about Dad. She said he was trying to rewrite the afternoon so that she looked reckless and he looked helpless. She reminded me that he had been in the house the entire time. She confirmed that he moved Nora's backpack after Nora kept reaching for it. She confirmed he knew where the inhaler had been placed. She confirmed he agreed they should wait after Nora's breathing seemed to improve. Then she wrote, "He was the one who said not to call you right away because you would make it a crisis." I saved the message. Mom continued. She said she took the inhaler because Nora had been coughing and getting frightened, and because she believed I had trained Nora to react to every tight feeling in her chest as if something terrible was happening. She said Nora had calmed down once without using it, which convinced her that the problem was mostly anxiety. Then came the sentence that mattered. I was trying to show her she could breathe without panicking for that thing. I read it twice. Not because it surprised me anymore, because for the first time, she had described the purpose of what she did without hiding behind words like misplaced or misunderstanding. She wanted to prove something. Nora was supposed to ask for the inhaler. Mom was supposed to refuse. Nora was supposed to calm down. Then Mom would have evidence that I was the one making my daughter dependent on medication and fear. I asked one question. When she asked again after the wheezing came back, "Why didn't you give it to her?" Mom answered, "Because giving it back the second she got scared again would teach her that panic worked." I put my phone down and walked into the kitchen. Nora was at the counter pouring cereal, one foot tucked behind the other, talking about a class project as if our family had not spent the last 2 months arguing over the afternoon. She nearly stopped being able to talk at all. I listened to her finish the story before I went back to my phone. That contrast mattered. My parents were still debating whether Nora had been dramatic. Nora had already moved on to being 9. Dad responded to Mom's accusations that same afternoon. He sent me 3 emails in less than an hour. The first said Susan was distorting his words. The second said he had never supported withholding medication as some kind of lesson. The third tried to explain what he had meant. She had been saying for months that you were making Nora too dependent on medication and constant reassurance. I did not agree with all of that. I agreed that we needed to stop reacting as if every cough meant an emergency. There it was. Dad was trying to distance himself from Mom's motive while confirming he knew exactly what that motive had been. He continued, "Susan wanted one normal afternoon where Nora could see she was capable of getting through discomfort without you hovering." I stared at the phrase. One normal afternoon? My mother had wanted to prove she could parent Nora better than I did. My father had understood what she was trying to prove. And both of them had been willing to use my daughter's body as the experiment. I did not send either of them an emotional response. I took out the timeline I had been maintaining since the hospital and built the sequence using only facts they had now confirmed themselves. Nora arrived with her rescue inhaler in the front pocket of her backpack. Mom intentionally took it away. Dad knew she had taken it. Dad moved the backpack after Nora continued reaching for it. Nora asked for the medication again. Both of them decided to wait after her symptoms temporarily improved. Dad told me she was fine during that period. Her breathing worsened. Neither of them called me immediately. Nora collapsed. Dad gave the inhaler to paramedics from the kitchen drawer. Emergency treatment followed. Afterward, both of them began describing the inhaler as misplaced or difficult to locate. I looked at the page for a long time. That was the story. Not Mom's version. Not Dad's. The overlap. Then I placed the old letter from 1996 beside it. 30 years earlier, the structure had been different in detail, but almost identical in function. Mom believed I was relying too heavily on an inhaler. She removed access. Diane responded when I had trouble breathing. Dad knew what Mom had done. Then Dad made the reaction the problem and threatened Diane if she kept telling outsiders what had happened. 2 9-year-old girls. Same family. Same argument about being dramatic. Same mother convinced she was teaching strength. Same father convinced keeping the peace mattered more than naming what happened. I did not need the childhood event to prove the current one. The current one already had its own evidence. The old letter explained why the current event felt so familiar to them. They had survived this pattern before. They expected to survive it again. A week later, I received a letter from a family law attorney representing my parents. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a court order. It was a restrained request asking me to reconsider my decision to block contact and warning that Susan and Kenneth were exploring their options regarding access to Nora. 3 months earlier, a letter like that might have terrified me. This time, I read it once and forwarded it to the attorney who had handled the final stages of my divorce. My custody order gave me sole legal decision-making authority and primary residential custody. My parents did not have automatic authority over Nora's school, medical care, or access. I changed nothing because of their letter. I sent my attorney the custody order, the police incident report number, the hospital paperwork I had, the EMS record, Dad's original text saying Nora was fine, his later written admissions, Mom's message, and the old letter from Diane as historical context. I did not tell my attorney I wanted to destroy my parents. I said, I want to know what I need to do to keep the current boundaries in place if they escalate. That was all. The answer was much less dramatic than my parents seemed to expect. Their letter did not force me to restore contact. There was no emergency hearing. There was no judge waiting to lecture anyone. Their attorney could advise them. Mine could advise me. If they actually filed something, there would be a process. They never did. I learned later that their own attorney had reviewed enough of the current record to tell them continuing to send pressure-filled messages was not helping them. That consequence satisfied me more than some theatrical courtroom scene ever could. For years, Dad had believed paper made him safer because he controlled the wording. Now the paper was the problem. His emails, his text messages, his statement, Mom's replies. The more they tried to explain themselves, the clearer the sequence became. By the end of that week, neither of them was speaking to me directly about Nora anymore. They were speaking through carefully worded messages, or through their attorney, or not at all. Then Mom sent one final text. So this is what you wanted? You wanted to turn us against each other? I read it while sitting beside Nora on the couch as she worked on a puzzle. For once, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I did not want them against each other. I wanted to stop standing between them and the consequences of what they had chosen. And that was exactly what I told her. No, I wrote back. I stopped standing between you and the consequences. You did the rest yourselves. Mom did not answer that night. Dad did. His message came almost an hour later. I told you the truth. I admitted what I did. How can you still cut me off? I read it once, then set my phone down until Nora was asleep. I had learned that nothing good came from answering my parents while I was angry, especially when Dad was still trying to turn honesty into a transaction. When I finally replied, I kept it short. I believe you didn't want Nora hurt. You still knew she was asking for help, and you helped make it harder for her to get it. He called immediately. He let it ring. Then another message appeared. That makes me sound like a monster. I wrote, I didn't call you one. That was part of what Dad still could not understand. He wanted every conversation to end with a verdict about what kind of person he was. Good father. Bad father. Loving grandfather. Dangerous grandfather. He could not tolerate the idea that I no longer needed to decide whether he was fundamentally good before deciding whether he was safe around Nora. What mattered was what he had done. He had moved her backpack. He had told her to listen to Mom. He had agreed to wait. He had known where the inhaler was. He had helped minimize the situation afterward. That was enough. Dad sent one more message. I made one terrible mistake. I looked at the old letter from Diane, still saved in the folder on my laptop. No, I wrote. You made the same kind of choice 30 years apart. He did not respond after that. Mom lasted another 2 days before trying again. Her message was longer. She said I was destroying the family over one mistake. She said she had raised me, loved me, helped me through childhood asthma, and spent years being available when I needed her. She said I was letting one frightening afternoon erase everything good she had ever done. That argument almost worked on me once. Not anymore. I answered, I'm not erasing anything. I'm deciding what access to Nora requires now. Mom replied. I was trying to help her. I know you believe that. That seemed to make her angrier than if I had called her cruel. She wrote, Then how can you punish me for trying to make her stronger? I stared at that sentence for a long time, because there it was again. Strength, as Mom understood it, meant needing less, asking less, complaining less, depending less. She had spent her whole life measuring love through endurance. I finally wrote, because she needed medicine, not a lesson. Mom did not answer. By early summer, the practical parts had settled into something much quieter than the war my parents seemed to expect. Their attorney never filed anything. My attorney told me to preserve what I had, keep communication limited, and continue following my existing custody order and Nora's medical plan. I kept my parents off school pickup lists and emergency contacts. They had no role in Nora's medical decisions. There were no surprise visits, just 5 minutes. No exceptions because somebody felt guilty. Dad tried once more through email to ask for supervised contact. I said no, not forever, not dramatically, just no. At that point, Nora did not need adults arranging forgiveness around her. She needed stability. I also stopped doing something else I had done for years without realizing how much it cost me. I stopped managing my parents. I did not call Dad to remind him about appointments. I did not fix Mom's online accounts. I did not smooth things over with relatives when they complained that Susan had offended someone. I did not explain Dad's intentions to people he had hurt. They had spent years telling me I overreacted. Yet somehow, I had also been the person they relied on every time their own decisions created a mess. That role ended with Nora's collapse. Not because I wanted revenge in the petty sense. Because I finally understood how much of my life had been built around absorbing consequences that belonged to other people. A few weeks later, I met Diane for coffee. The first 20 minutes were awkward. We had too much history and not enough shared life. She looked older than the aunt I remembered, obviously, but there were small things about her face that pulled childhood memories forward. The way she tilted her head before answering. The way she folded the paper sleeve around her coffee cup. I told her something I had been carrying since our first call. "I'm still angry you stopped trying." "I know. You left me with them." "I did." She did not defend herself. That mattered. Then she said, "I'm sorry I convinced myself leaving was the same thing as surviving." I looked at her for a long time. I don't know what our relationship is supposed to be now. Neither do I. That was probably the best answer she could have given. So we did not invent a reunion. We started with coffee. Then another call. Then a few stories. Diane told me things about my childhood without telling me what I was supposed to feel about them. Sometimes her memories matched mine. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes we left the disagreement alone. For the first time, I was allowed to remember without someone editing the meaning afterward. By August, Nora was doing well. One morning before school, she came downstairs wearing her backpack and eating half a piece of toast at the same time. I asked, "Where's your inhaler?" She rolled her eyes in the way only a 9-year-old can. "Front pocket." "Show me." She unzipped it, tapped the inhaler and spacer, then closed it again. "Happy?" "Very." She started toward the door, then stopped. "Mom?" "Yeah?" I knew I needed it that day. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Something closer to grief for both of us. "I know." She looked at me. I was right. "Yes," I said. "You were." That was the moment I understood what had really changed. For years I thought protecting a family meant making room for context, forgiving bad days, refusing to define people by their worst choices. There is nothing wrong with that idea until it is only applied in one direction. Mom was never supposed to be defined by the inhaler she took. Dad was never supposed to be defined by the lie he told afterward. But Diane had been defined as unstable for objecting. I had been defined as dramatic for being frightened. Nora had nearly inherited the same label, just for knowing she could not breathe. I could not change what my parents had taught me when I was 9. I could change what Nora learned at 9. The inhaler stayed in the front pocket of her backpack, exactly where she could reach it. No adult got to move it to teach her a lesson. No grandparent got to decide that needing help made her weak. And no one in my family got to rewrite what happened, simply because the truth made them uncomfortable. My parents liked to say I broke the family. I did not. I stopped holding together a version of it that required the person who got hurt to carry the shame. You cannot always control what your family believes, but you can control what access they have to you and your children. When someone dismisses a medical need, ignores a safety plan, or tells a child that asking for help is dramatic, you should treat that behavior seriously. Love does not make unsafe decisions acceptable, and good intentions do not erase consequences. You also do not need to prove that someone is evil before setting a boundary. If their actions are unsafe, protecting your child comes first. You should document important incidents while the details are fresh, keep texts and emails, follow medical guidance, and use the proper professional or legal channels when necessary. Most importantly, teach children that they are allowed to speak up when something feels wrong with their bodies. A child who learns to trust their own warning signs is better prepared to protect themselves later in life. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, does not require restoring the same access or trust. Accountability means allowing consequences to remain where they belong. If this story gave you something useful to think about, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more family stories about boundaries, accountability, and choosing wisely when trust is broken.